right. Well, I don't want to make Miss Laura Forczyk wait. It's time for What's Going On. Miss Forczyk is the owner of space consulting firm Astrolytical, specializing in space science, industry, and policy, offering space career coaching services, some good successes there lately, and publishing industry reports. She serves as an advisor for Cislunar Space Development Company and for All Moonkind, and she is the VP of Research and Analytics for the Beyond Earth Institute. She serves as a mentor for the Brooke Owens Fellowship Program, and she is a NASA subject matter expert for planetary science missions. She has published two books now, Rise of the Space Age Millennials, and the brand new book, Becoming Off-Worldly, my personal signed copy. Thank you, Laura. It's beautiful. And fill us in on what's going on.
Thank you so much, Lee, and enjoy the book. And it's been 1 month since I published, so if all of you haven't gotten it yet, please reach out to me or go to the website or get it on Amazon. So the topic for this month's Conversations for the Future is space investment. So money, 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 right? That was a fun topic last year, let me tell you. So last year, you might have noticed a lot of money coming into the space sector. According to Space Capital, space infrastructure companies, so there's different ways to define space companies, right? But they define space infrastructure companies as receiving a record number of investments, $14.5 billion of private investments in 2021, more than a 50% increase from 2020, which was $9.8 billion. So that's just one space investors tally. You might find different numbers out there, but that's still impressive. And I think everyone would agree that last year was record breaking. You might have noticed SPACs. So SPACs were especially popular early last year. They got less popular as the year went on and more regulations started popping up, but they're still pretty popular. So you're still going to see special purpose acquisition companies doing those quick mergers to have space companies go public. That's going to continue in 2022. I think most people agree. And I think a lot of people are going to agree that 2022 is going to be just as successful as 2021. You know, we're still early in the year, so something still might go awry, but it does not look like the money is going to stop flowing, despite the fact that recent analysis has shown that SPAC companies, in particular, space SPAC companies, have not actually done very well. But that doesn't mean that the investments are going to stop, whether it's traditional public exits or whether it's continuing private investments or whether it's SPAC. There's just going to continue to be money flowing. And you see this just in the past few weeks. There's investment announced almost daily. And so I'm just going to go through a few of them. And I'm on an abridged schedule here. I think I only have 15 minutes this time to speak. But there's a lot. So I'm just gonna, go through some of these and you can see just the diversity. And keep in mind, it's not just here in the United States where traditionally there has been a lot of private money, but it's actually really global. And you're seeing rise in investments in certain areas like in Europe and China, for example. And so just for example, yesterday, Aerospace Lab, which is in Belgium, I believe, raised 40 million euros or the equivalent of $45.5 million in a Series B round. And you'll see that most of the investments are around that multi-million dollar level. Some of them are just like single digits, multi-millions. Some of them are hundreds of millions. A few of them go into the billions. So not too many though, but you do see a diversity of ranges when it comes to investments. And sometimes that is equivalent to the round or the progress that a company has made, or sometimes it's just equivalent to the hype. I'll be honest with you. I think a lot of times investments are really just equivalent to hype. And a lot of times space investors are investing in one thing to get their hands in another thing. And I'm no expert in investments. This is just what I understand of the industry as a scientist trying to understand financial investments. So moving on from the Aerospace Lab, ICEYE, which is probably familiar to most of you. They've been around a while. They are a synthetic aperture radar satellite imaging company. ICEYE, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right. I think I am. ICEYE. They raised $136 million in Series D. So they've been around a while. They've been raising money for a while. eSpace, which is doing a space cloud service server. That's actually becoming quite popular these days. They raised $50 million in seed funding. Now, I don't know how to pronounce this, so I apologize. Satellite. Satellite is an Internet of Things connectivity company. They want to operate a satellite network for IoT. They raised the equivalent of $11.4 million. Empower Technology, which does solar cells. And of course, it depends on your definition of a space company, right? But this company does solar cells for space applications. So they are a space company, but it really depends on how you define a space company, right? But Empower Technology raised $10 million in Series B funding. Oxford Space Systems, they do space antennas, deployable space antennas, and they raised the equivalent of $5.4 million. So on the lower end here, and also on the lower end, composite company, Atomic 6, which again, is that a space company? Sure. I mean, composites are in space hardware. They raised $3.2 million, and they raised it in convertible debt financing, which I don't know what that is. I'll be honest with you. So maybe someone in one of the future talks during this conference will be able to explain the differences in all the different investment types. Deorbit, that's a big one, right? They've been around quite a while. They are actually going to go public. They announced that through Breeze Holdings Acquisition Corporation, $1.28 billion valuation. Now, valuations can change. And we've seen this with some of the SPACs last year where the valuations were actually lower than what they were initially announced to be. But at this point, Deorbit is currently valued at $1.28 billion, which is amazing. So, I didn't go into who they are. So they're a satellite decommissioning company. So you might see some hot areas being satellite servicing, space debris cleanup. Those are some really hot areas right now. And so Deorbit fits right in there. Orion Space, which is a Chinese company, they raised the equivalent of $47 million in Series A funding. And we're seeing a lot of Chinese private companies get investments these days. And when you say private companies and Chinese companies, there's a little asterisk because it really depends on how you define a private commercial company in China. But a lot of times they are trying to become more commercial in the sense that we as Americans understand it, at least. And so you're seeing a lot more private investment into Chinese space companies. So Orion Space, they do space transportation, and they raised the equivalent of $47 million. Arc Edge Space, which does microsatellites. It's a Japanese company, I believe, and they raised the equivalent of $14.55 million in Series A. Epsilon 3, they do software for space missions, and they raised the equivalent of $2.8 million in seed funding. And Small Spark, which does launch technology, raised the equivalent of about $1.5 million. And you can see the diversity of investors that are investing in these things. Some of the big names that have been around a while that are specific space investors are Space Angels, which is related to space capital, Seraphim, and Space Ventures, which is sort of crowdfunding platform for space investments. And so there's a whole lot more than that invest in space as part of their portfolios. And so there's a lot of capital that's just been around a while, a lot of different investment firms that have been around a while, but there's also a lot of new players. So if you go through some of these different investments, you might come across names that you've never heard of, new people who are getting involved in space who have never been involved in space before, which is really actually quite exciting because it brings in new ideas. It brings in different technologies from different sectors that might benefit the space company that is being invested in, right? It's sort of a two-way street when it comes to investments. Yes, there's money flow, but there's also a technology and idea exchange too. And so I believe it's actually a really good thing for space companies to be getting investments from outsiders, from people who have not traditionally been investing in space. If you want more information about different space investments, Payload, which is a space published media company, as well as a daily newsletter. They're excellent at providing these little tidbits. They do a term sheet every month. Their newsletter is daily, so they sometimes include it in the daily section, but you can just sign up. It's free. So a little plug for Payload right there. And there's other news companies and investment companies that put out news as well. For example, Seraphim just did a thing today that I didn't get a chance to read yet about Deorbit and their plans to go public. So I am not an expert. I just have worked with space investors, but I'm not an expert in space investing. So you might want to hold some of your questions for the speakers. They're going to be talking after me, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Laura. Yeah, that two-way street. I feel like the space industry is a little, has been a little bit more isolated and doesn't look outside, very focused on taking the technologies that we come up with and trying to make sure people know about them and can apply them commercially. But that opportunity to learn from other industries seems to be a little bit slower, a little less energetic.
So I just got notification from Lee that we need to take up more time here on this investment section here about what's going on in space investment. So I would actually like to hear from the audience as to what your predictions are for 2022. So for preparation of this talk, I was reading some of those predictions by investors, right? And it is interesting to see where they believe the next big areas of investment will be in the space sector. I already brought up one area, that satellite servicing and space debris removal, which are, I guess, distinct but related. And space transportation is always a big one, whether that's launching, rockets from Earth, or whether that's actually the space tug concept, changing orbits, or even deep space propulsion companies, for example. So I think that's another area that might be very interesting. And of course, data. I mean, like whether it's a constellation for internet, or whether it is some other means of IoT. There's just so many different demands for data that space can provide, or space hardware can provide. So I'm curious to know from our audience where you think the big investments are going to be in 2022. Well, while you're thinking about that,
I've got some questions for you. Do you know the different what how they defined a space infrastructure company? What were the brackets on that?
oh, I did not look into that detail.
Yeah,
But if
okay.
you're curious, look at Space Capital. They are based in New York. They've been around a while, several years. I don't know how long they've been around, but yeah. So when you talk about the space economy, and I think we've talked about this in previous conferences, it really depends on how you define a space company, right? Is a company that uses space data for navigation or timing, or Earth observation images? Is that a space company, or does it need to be defined by direct access to space, whether it's hardware or software on a space satellite? So there's different ways to define it. So when you look to see what space investments are, you might find different definitions just depending on who's included in that space sector.
Yeah, that's great information. We do have a question from Michael Bruno and Stan. I'm not sure if you're looking to ask a question. Are you looking to speak?
Sure. I
Yes.
had a quick
Go
question or
ahead.
comment for everyone, Laura and everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, so my question is, the space um, economy, you often see these $400 billion numbers, 350, $400 billion numbers. Anyone who's looked at that knows that that includes an awful lot of things that probably most people wouldn't consider space, and that have some double counting inherent in the way they put those things together. And my question is pretty simple. Does anyone think that investors are just jumping into the space industry based on these big numbers, or are they sophisticated enough to look at, say, these satellite manufacturing or the launch business, or some particular segment of the market that's relevant to their investment? Or do you think, like, particularly retail investors are just running in after the hype of these big numbers that are projected to be trillions of dollars without understanding them? I'm just curious whether people actually make business decisions based on these sort of slightly overhyped numbers.
Yeah, I don't think you can categorize all space investors as one big thing, right?
Of course, yeah.
In general, I do think in general, people are taken by hype. And I
Okay.
think that, it's not just investors that are taken by hype. I think a lot of people are taken by hype in the space sector and outside. And it's just, there's a lot of reasons for that. People want to be involved in the next big thing, and they're seeing space as the next big thing. And whether they trust the numbers that, certain people put out, I don't know how much they trust them. I don't know how much they dig into them. Probably depends investor by investor, how much due diligence they're doing. But they're still going to be swept up in that hype, as we all are in some way or another. Every one of us on this call, right, is probably swept up in some excitement that we're like, yeah, maybe those numbers are a little bit exaggerated, but I still want in, right?
Right.
And that's what those investors, I think, are doing.
Okay.
They also count on the fact that some of these companies are going to fail, and that's why they have a portfolio, right?
Right.
So if one succeeds, well, then it makes it worth it. That's the impression that I get, at least. I personally am not a space investor. I don't have that kind of money, but that is the impression that I get, that they're putting their money around knowing that a lot of them are going to fail, but they are hoping that they're going to be latching on to the next big thing. And, in some cases they have succeeded. And a lot of them also are jumping on the fact that SpaceX is hot, but SpaceX cannot, it's not publicly traded. They're raising money, sure, for accredited investors, but investors who want to invest in SpaceX cannot do so. So they find an equivalent in their minds of, oh, this is SpaceX like, or this one can grow like SpaceX or partner with, whatever it is. So I think a lot of times there's one company or one thing that's happening that an investor is excited about, and they want to do something similar to that. They want to latch onto something similar and be involved in that.
Yeah, I think the good news there is that space is a growth industry. It's going to be huge. It's for all the reasons we all know, it's going to be significant for the economy, regardless of what the actual number is. So I think the impact of space is huge, and there's a different number that's how big the market is and the market by segment. I think those are different. The other thing, to Lee's question about where, or to your thoughts about what's coming in 2022, I just wonder to what extent the so-called Starship Singularity, to what extent, if we get to $100 per kilogram, as Elon said in his update, does that, is there a new wave of investments coming along that take advantage of that? And that's where I haven't seen a lot yet. And I don't know whether that's because people haven't had the time to think about what business models make sense at that level, or whether it's because there's concern about the risk that Starship might not happen. Or it might happen to the degree, and I don't know what the risks are there from an FAA perspective, from a technology perspective. One thing that occurs to me, though, in terms of SpaceX's long-range viability, if for some reason Starlink doesn't work out, maybe because all the other companies get together and don't allow the proposal to go through, or the FCC puts a kibosh on or something, if SpaceX doesn't start generating the bulk of its revenue from Starlink, it just won't have the funds to do everything it wants to do. So I just don't know. But to me, it strikes me that I want to see more business models related to that lower cost to orbit that would be an order of magnitude or better than where it is today.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on that. I think that some of the Starship Singularity is already built in, and that's some of the
Okay.
hype. I mean, we've been talking about that for a while, and that $100 number, has been out there in some form or other for probably the past year. And I think a lot of people see that as a game changer, just as they've demonstrated that that was a game changer in the last downshift in the cost of launch. So I think there's a projection there, and that people are baking those into their numbers. Another point is 2015 is when really things started ramping up in space investment, private money, space investment, right? And now we're in 2022, which is the 7 years. That's usually the long end of what somebody would be looking for an exit. And those are we're going to get some rude awakenings, or maybe already have, on a number, but that 7 year clock that's been ticking, we're here now. And I think that may, inform some of the future investments, is what happened to the 2015s, what happened to the 2016s as we head into next year. And then one final point is, when in November, we had our Space Money event, Space Money. And we had a panel of space investors, Seraphim, Starbridge, an angel investor, and uh, no, I can't remember the other one, but each of those four companies that were represented had different investment criteria. So one of them was Seraphim was very focused on the technology, and they didn't worry so much about the management team because they figured, well, if that doesn't work out, we got the technology, we're ahead of the game there, and we can move on. The angel investor in that group was focused on the management team, right? Is the talent there? What do we need to do to develop the talent into the next phase? And then Seraphim, not Seraphim, Starbridge is very focused on whether there's a market. It's an established and proven market for what's out there. And so each of those drivers, each company has to decide what their investment criteria are. And I think that that panel really demonstrated that well. Let's see. We have some questions in the chat. Where do you rank EO in regards to the growth sectors? Higher than space tugs, but below comsats, for example, Laura?
It's hard to know. So Earth observation has been, an application of satellites for so many decades, right? So is
Yes.
communication, but now we're seeing communications change from, GEO to LEO, for example, and it's becoming sort of a hot area. There's almost a competition going on with communication satellites right now, it seems. And space tugs is one of those unproven technologies that is just starting to get demonstrations, and so I think we're going to see more growth there as that concept is demonstrated, as the business concept is demonstrated. The technology also needs to be demonstrated too, so we're starting to see that happen. Earth observation is almost easy because the technology is there. There's ways to improve the technology, new sensors and SAR. I mean, there's just so many different ways to get more and more and more data, but it's almost saturated. And what's the hot area now is not necessarily getting the data, it's processing the data. How do you go through with different algorithms and different ways of processing data? How do you go through that and get something intelligent out that you can send to a user, and a user can easily parse through it rather than just having raw data, right? And I see our next speakers here. So I'll just wrap up in saying I don't know the answer to your question as to where that ranks, but it'll be interesting to see how the technology plays out with some of the newer technologies compared to some of the older technologies that are being used in new ways.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I hope the sales of your new book, Becoming Off-Worldly, continue to grow. And certainly everybody here should be on Amazon or on the Astrolytical website to find Laura's book.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate it.